I never thought a simple dinner could change the course of my life, but here I am, still reeling from the events of last Friday. My name is Emily, and up until that night, I believed I was living the American dream. I had a successful career, a loving husband, and had married into what I thought was a respectable, affluent family. Little did I know that this dinner would be the beginning of the end of that life. It was a crisp autumn evening in New England when I pulled up to my in-laws' sprawling mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. The maple trees lining the driveway were ablaze with red and gold leaves, a stark contrast to the pristine white columns of the house. I remember thinking how picture-perfect it all looked, like something out of a lifestyle magazine. If only I had known then that appearances can be deceiving. As I walked up the grand staircase to the front door, I smoothed down my navy blue dress, a designer piece I'd splurged on to impress my mother-in-law, Margaret. The door swung open before I could knock, and there stood Richard, my husband of 3 years, looking dapper in a tailored suit but wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're late," he said, his tone clipped. "Mother's been asking where you were." I glanced at my watch, confused. "I'm only 5 minutes late, traffic was..." "Never mind," he cut me off, ushering me inside. "Let's just get this over with." The foyer was impressive as always, with its crystal chandelier and marble floors, but tonight it felt cold and unwelcoming. As we made our way to the dining room, I could hear the murmur of voices and the clink of glasses. My stomach tightened with anticipation, or was it dread? The dining room was a sight to behold. A long mahogany table dominated the space, set with fine china and sparkling silverware. Candles flickered in ornate holders, casting a warm glow over the room. At the head of the table sat Charles, my father-in-law, a distinguished-looking man with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual frown. To his right was Margaret, her blonde hair coiffed to perfection, lips pursed as she saw me enter. "Ah, Emily," Charles said, his voice resonating through the room. "We were beginning to wonder if you'd grace us with your presence." I felt my cheeks flush as I took my seat next to Richard. "I'm sorry for the delay. The traffic on I-95 was terrible." Margaret's eyebrow arched. "Perhaps you should have left earlier, dear. Punctuality is a virtue in this family." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The tension in the room was palpable, and we hadn't even started the first course. As the evening progressed, I found myself growing increasingly uncomfortable. The conversation flowed around me, touching on topics I knew little about: stock portfolios, yacht clubs, and charity galas I'd never attended. I tried to contribute where I could, but each attempt was met with thinly veiled disdain from Margaret or dismissive grunts from Charles. It was during the main course, a beautifully presented roast duck with a cherry glaze, that Margaret turned her attention fully to me. "So, Emily," she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "how is that quaint little job of yours going?" "What was it again?" "Marketing." I swallowed hard, setting down my fork. "Public relations, actually. It's going well, thank you. We just landed a major account with..." "Oh, that's nice," Margaret interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "I do hope they're paying you enough to keep up with our family's lifestyle. It must be so difficult, coming from such modest beginnings." I felt a flash of anger but pushed it down. "My job pays well, Margaret. I'm quite satisfied with my career." Charles chuckled, a sound devoid of any real mirth. "Well, as long as you're satisfied. Although, one would hope for more than mere satisfaction in life, wouldn't you agree, Richard?" I turned to my husband, hoping for some support, but Richard merely shrugged, his eyes fixed on his plate. "Emily's job is fine," he muttered, not meeting my gaze. The conversation moved on, but I felt increasingly isolated. Every comment seemed designed to remind me of my place, or rather, my lack of place in this family. I was an outsider, tolerated but never truly accepted. As the dinner neared its end, I found myself counting the minutes until we could leave. The dessert arrived, a gold-leafed chocolate soufflé decorated with what looked like edible diamonds. It was extravagant, over the top, and perfectly in line with everything else about this evening. That's when Richard leaned over to me, a strange smirk playing on his lips. "You've got the check, right?" he whispered. "It's $15,000. For a moment, I thought he was joking. But the ice-cold glare from Margaret across the table told me otherwise. My mind raced. $15,000 for a dinner? That was more than I made in 2 months. Surely they couldn't be serious. I don't understand, I stammered, looking from Richard to his parents. Why would I be paying for this dinner? Charles cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable for the first time that evening. Well, Emily, we thought it was time you contributed something to these family gatherings. You've been enjoying our hospitality for years now. I felt as though I'd been slapped. But I don't have that kind of money on me. I can't possibly. Oh, for heaven's sake, Margaret snapped. Don't tell me you can't afford a simple dinner. What do you do with all the money Richard gives you? My cheeks burned with humiliation. Richard doesn't give me any money, I said quietly. I pay for everything with my own salary. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel their judgment, their disappointment, their utter disdain for me radiating across the table. Richard sat beside me, silent and unmoved, as if this was all perfectly normal. With shaking hands, I reached for my purse. I had some savings, money I'd been putting aside for a rainy day. I never imagined I'd be using it like this. As I transferred the funds, I felt something break inside me. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, about putting me in my place. As we left the mansion that night, I felt hollow. The cool autumn air that had seemed so pleasant earlier now chilled me to the bone. Richard walked ahead of me, not bothering to see if I was keeping up. In that moment, I realized that the life I thought I had, the loving marriage, the supportive family, was nothing but an illusion. Little did I know, this dinner was just the beginning. The events that would unfold in the coming days would shake the very foundation of my world, exposing truths I never could have imagined and testing my strength in ways I never thought possible. As I climbed into our car, a sense of foreboding settled over me. Something had changed tonight, and there was no going back. The drive home from my in-laws' mansion was eerily silent. Richard gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, and I couldn't bring myself to break the tension. The events of the dinner kept replaying in my mind, each remembered slight feeling like a fresh wound. As we pulled into our driveway, I hoped that once we were home, we could talk about what had happened, maybe even laugh about the ridiculousness of it all. How wrong I was. The moment we stepped through our front door, the atmosphere shifted. The silence that had accompanied us on the drive home suddenly felt oppressive, suffocating. I reached out to touch Richard's arm, seeking some form of comfort or connection, but he jerked away as if my touch burned him. "Richard, what's going on?" I asked, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the quiet of our house. He turned to face me then, and I almost took a step back. The man looking at me wasn't the husband I knew. His eyes were cold, his jaw set in a hard line. "Pack your things," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. "What? What are you talking about?" Instead of answering, Richard brushed past me and headed upstairs. I followed him, confusion and fear battling for dominance in my mind. When I reached our bedroom, I found him yanking open drawers and pulling out my clothes. "Richard, stop. What are you doing?" I cried, trying to grab a shirt from his hands. He shoved me away, not roughly, but with enough force to make me stumble. "You're done here," he spat, stuffing my clothes into a garbage bag. "I want a divorce. You're nothing but a leech, Emily. Get out of my house, and don't come back." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. This had to be some kind of sick joke, right? But as I watched Richard methodically packing my life away, the reality of the situation began to sink in. "Richard, please," I begged, tears starting to form in my eyes. "Can we talk about this? I don't understand what's happening." He paused for a moment, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of the man I married in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "There's nothing to talk about," he said coldly. "You've been using me, using my family. Did you think we wouldn't figure it out?" "Using you?" I repeated, incredulous. "Richard, I've been working hard, contributing to our life together. How can you say that?" He laughed then, a harsh, bitter sound that made me flinch. "Contributing? Don't make me laugh. You're nothing without us, Emily. You're from a nobody family, with a nobody job. Everything you have is because of me and my family. Each word was like a knife, cutting deeper and deeper. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the shock of it all had rendered me nearly speechless. As Richard continued to pack my belongings, I sank down onto the bed, our bed, trying to make sense of how my life had fallen apart so quickly. That's when I heard footsteps on the stairs. For a wild moment, I thought perhaps it was the police, coming to put an end to this madness. But no, it was Margaret, my mother-in-law, her face a mask of smug contempt. "Oh good, Richard, you're taking out the trash," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. She turned her gaze to me, and I shrank back from the hatred I saw there. "You never belonged in this family. Goodbye, parasite." I looked from Margaret to Richard, desperately searching for any sign that this was all a terrible mistake. But their faces were set, united in their desire to cast me out. In that moment, I realized that the family I thought I had married into, the life I thought I had built, was nothing but a carefully constructed lie. With shaking hands, I began to help pack my things. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else go through the motions. I packed my clothes, my books, the few personal items I had brought into this house. Each object I touched seemed to hold a memory, a reminder of the life I thought I had. As I packed, I couldn't help but think about how I had ended up here. I remembered the day I met Richard, how charming and kind he had seemed. I thought about our whirlwind romance, the fancy dates, the expensive gifts. Had it all been a setup? Had he been playing me from the very beginning? And what about my career? I had worked hard to get where I was, but now doubt crept in. Had I really earned my position, or had Richard's influence played a bigger role than I realized? The uncertainty made me feel sick to my stomach. Within an hour, my life had been reduced to a few garbage bags and boxes. Richard carried them downstairs and unceremoniously dumped them on the front lawn. I followed behind, feeling numb and disconnected from reality. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, and I shivered. I hadn't even thought to grab a jacket. I turned back to the house, to Richard standing in the doorway, hoping against hope that he would change his mind, that this was all some horrible misunderstanding. "Richard, please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can work this out. Whatever I've done wrong, I can fix it. Just give me a chance." For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then Margaret appeared behind him, her hand on his shoulder. "Don't let her manipulate you, Richard," she hissed. "She's shown her true colors. It's time to cut her loose." Richard's face hardened again. "You heard my mother. It's over, Emily. Don't come back here." And with that, he closed the door. I stood there on the lawn, surrounded by the hastily packed remnants of my life, staring at the house that had been my home. The lights went out one by one, until I was left in darkness. Reality began to set in, bringing with it a wave of panic. Where would I go? What would I do? I had put all my savings into paying for that ridiculous dinner. I had no family nearby, and most of my friends were really Richard's friends. In the space of a few hours, I had become truly alone. I pulled out my phone, thinking I could call a taxi or book a hotel room. But as I unlocked the screen, I realized with a sinking feeling that my credit cards were joint accounts with Richard. Would they even work anymore? I had some cash in my wallet, but not nearly enough for a hotel room. With no other options, I began to walk. I didn't have a destination in mind, I just knew I couldn't stay there, staring at the dark windows of the house that had rejected me. As I walked, pulling my suitcase behind me and carrying as much as I could, tears began to fall freely down my face. The streets were quiet at this late hour, the houses I passed full of families sleeping peacefully, unaware of the drama unfolding outside. I felt like a ghost, invisible and disconnected from the world around me. How could life go on as normal when my entire world had just imploded? After walking for what felt like hours, I found myself in front of a small motel. It wasn't much, certainly nothing like the luxury I had become accustomed to, but it was a roof over my head. I checked in, using most of the cash I had on me to pay for a week's stay. The room was small and shabby, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell. But as I sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. Yes, I had lost everything. Yes, I had been betrayed and cast aside by the people I thought loved me. But I was still here. I was still breathing. And for the first time in years, I was truly free. As I lay down on the uncomfortable bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, I made a promise to myself. I would not let this break me. Somehow, someway, I would rebuild my life. And I would never again allow myself to be so dependent on others that I could lose everything in a single night. Little did I know, as I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, that this was just the beginning. The events set in motion that night would lead me down a path I never could have imagined, full of twists and turns, dangers and revelations. But in that moment, all I knew was that I had survived the worst night of my life. And that had to count for something. Sleep eluded me that night in the dingy motel room. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard's cold stare, heard Margaret's venomous words. The ceiling fan creaked rhythmically above me, a constant reminder of how far I had fallen in just a few hours. From a luxurious home to this, a room that smelled of stale cigarettes and broken dreams. As the night wore on, I tossed and turned, my mind racing. How had I not seen this coming? Were there signs I had missed? I replayed every interaction with Richard and his family over the past few years, searching for clues. But all I found were more questions. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep altogether. I sat up in bed, wrapping the thin, scratchy blanket around my shoulders, and stared out the window. The neon vacancy sign flickered erratically, casting an eerie red glow into the room. It felt fitting. My life, too, was flickering, unstable. I tried to think practically about what I would do next. I had a job, at least for now, but would Richard try to interfere with that too? My phone lay silent on the bedside table. No missed calls, no messages. It was as if I had ceased to exist in the world I had known just yesterday. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the threadbare curtains, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. It was the kind of calm that comes after a storm, when you realize you've survived something you never thought you could. I was alone, yes, but I was also free. Free from the constant judgment, the subtle put-downs, the feeling that I was never quite good enough. I got up and took a shower, letting the lukewarm water wash away the tears and the shock of the night before. The towels were rough against my skin, nothing like the plush Egyptian cotton I was used to, but they did the job. As I dried off, I caught a glimpse of myself in the cloudy mirror. I looked tired, my eyes puffy from crying, but there was something else there too, a glimmer of determination. "You can do this, Emily," I told my reflection. "You're stronger than they think." I dressed in the clothes I had hastily packed the night before, a simple blouse and slacks that felt like armor against the world. I was just considering whether to brave the vending machine in the lobby for breakfast when my phone buzzed. The sound made me jump, shattering the quiet of the early morning. For a moment, I just stared at the device, my heart racing. Who could be calling at this hour? Part of me hoped it was Richard, calling to say it had all been a terrible mistake. Another part dreaded hearing his voice, afraid of what more hurt he could inflict. With a shaking hand, I picked up the phone. Richard's name flashed on the screen. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was to come, and answered. "Hello." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, a mix of hope and fear. "Emily." Richard's voice came through, sounding nothing like the cold, dismissive man from the night before. He sounded panicked. "Thank God you answered. Something's happened. We need you back at the house." I sat down heavily on the bed, my mind whirling. "What? Richard, what are you talking about? Last night you told me to never come back, and now I know, he interrupted, his words coming fast and frantic. "But things have changed. Please, Emily, it's an emergency." In the background, I could hear what sounded like sobbing. It took me a moment to realize it was Margaret. The woman who had called me a parasite just hours ago was now wailing like a child. "Richard, slow down," I said, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. "What kind of emergency? What's happened?" There was a pause, and when Richard spoke again, his voice was lower, as if he was trying not to be overheard. "It's Dad. Charles. He's gone." "Gone?" I repeated, not comprehending. What do you mean, gone? I can't explain over the phone, Richard said, his voice cracking. Please, Emily. I know we don't deserve it, but we need you. Can you come? I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing. Charles was gone. What did that mean? And why on earth would they need me? After everything they had done, everything they had said, how could they possibly expect me to help? But even as these thoughts raced through my mind, I found myself standing up, gathering my things. Because despite everything, despite the hurt and the betrayal, a small part of me still cared. And a larger part was desperately curious to know what could have happened to turn things around so dramatically. I'll be there in an hour, I heard myself say, and then I hung up before I could change my mind. As I checked out of the motel and hailed a taxi, I tried to prepare myself for what I might find at the house. Had Charles had a heart attack? A stroke? Or was this all some elaborate trick to humiliate me further? The taxi driver gave me a concerned look in the rearview mirror. I must have looked a sight, a woman in rumpled clothes, with dark circles under her eyes, heading to one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in town at the crack of dawn. Everything okay, miss? He asked as we pulled out of the motel parking lot. I met his eyes in the mirror and managed a weak smile. I'm not sure, I answered honestly. But I guess I'm about to find out. As we drove through the quiet streets, I watched the scenery change from the rundown area around the motel to the manicured lawns and grand houses of Richard's neighborhood. It felt surreal, like I was traveling between two different worlds. In a way, I supposed I was. We pulled up to the house, my house, or what had been my house until last night, and I felt a surge of anxiety. The place looked exactly the same as when I had left, but everything had changed. I paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, gathering my courage. As I walked up the path to the front door, I noticed something odd. The curtains in the living room window were askew, and I could see lights on inside. That was unusual for this time of morning. Margaret was usually fastidious about appearances, even when no one was watching. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door swung open. Richard stood there, looking nothing like the polished, confident man I was used to seeing. His hair was a mess, his clothes rumpled as if he'd slept in them. But it was his eyes that really caught my attention. They were wide with what looked like fear. Emily, he said, his voice hoarse. You came. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Now that I was here, facing him, all the hurt and anger from the night before came flooding back. But mixed with it was a new emotion, concern. Whatever had happened, it was clearly serious. Richard stepped back, allowing me to enter. As I walked into the foyer, I was struck by how different it felt. The house that had always seemed so imposing, so perfect, now felt vulnerable somehow. I could hear Margaret's sobs coming from the living room. Taking a deep breath, I walked towards the sound, Richard following close behind. As I entered the room, I was met with a scene of chaos. Margaret was huddled on the sofa, her usual perfectly coiffed appearance in disarray. Her mascara had run, leaving dark streaks down her cheeks, and she was clutching a crumpled tissue in her hand. But it was the rest of the room that really caught my attention. The place looked like it had been ransacked. Cushions were thrown from the couch, a lamp lay broken on the floor, and papers were scattered everywhere. In the middle of it all stood two police officers, looking grim. As I took in the scene, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, one of the officers turned to me. And who might you be, he asked, his tone professional but tinged with suspicion. Before I could answer, Richard stepped forward. This is my wife, Emily, he said quickly. I called her here. She was out for the night. I felt a flash of anger at the lie, but now wasn't the time to correct it. Instead, I turned to the officer. Can someone please tell me what's going on? Where's Charles? The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before responding. Mr. Hartley is missing, And given the state of the house and some other evidence we've found, we're treating this as a potential case of foul play. The words hit me like a physical blow. Foul play? Charles missing? I looked at Richard, then at Margaret, seeing the fear and desperation in their eyes. Whatever I had expected when I got that phone call, it wasn't this. As I stood there in the ransacked living room, Caught between my anger at this family and my growing concern over what had happened, I realized that my life had once again been turned upside down. But this time, I was walking into the chaos with my eyes wide open. Whatever was going on here, I was determined to find out the truth, for Charles's sake, and for my own. The living room of the Hartley mansion, once a symbol of opulence and refinement, now resembled a war zone. As I stood there, taking in the chaos around me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unreality. Less than 24 hours ago, I had been unceremoniously thrown out of this very house. Now, I was back, standing amidst overturned furniture and scattered papers, with two grim-faced police officers regarding me with suspicion. "Mrs. Hartley," one of the officers addressed me, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "We need to ask you a few questions about your whereabouts last night." I opened my mouth to respond, but Richard cut in before I could speak. "Is that really necessary, officer? My wife was out for the night, as I mentioned. She had nothing to do with what happened here." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. "We'll need to hear that from Mrs. Hartley herself, sir. Standard procedure." I felt a flash of anger at Richard's attempt to control the narrative. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I wasn't just out for the night. I was Emily," Margaret's voice interrupted, thick with tears. She had risen from the sofa and was now standing beside me, her usual poise completely shattered. "Please, we need your help. We can sort out other matters later." I looked at her, really looked at her, and was struck by the fear in her eyes. Whatever had happened here, it had shaken her to her core. Despite everything, I felt a twinge of pity. Turning back to the officer, I took a deep breath. "I was staying at a motel last night," I said truthfully. "The Pinewood Inn on Maple Street. You can check with them if you need to verify." The officer nodded, jotting something down in his notebook. "And can you tell us why you were staying at a motel instead of here at home?" I hesitated, glancing at Richard and Margaret. Their faces were a mixture of panic and pleading. In that moment, I made a decision. "My husband and I had an argument," I said carefully. "I decided to spend the night elsewhere to cool off. Richard called me this morning and asked me to come home because of the emergency. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't entirely a lie either." The officer seemed to accept it, at least for now. "All right, Mrs. Hartley. We may have more questions for you later. Please don't leave town for the time being." As the officers moved away to continue their investigation, I turned to Richard and Margaret. "Now," I said, keeping my voice low, "one of you needs to tell me exactly what happened here." Richard ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "It was late, after you left," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "We all went to bed. But then, around 2 a.m., we heard a crash from downstairs. Dad went to check it out. We heard shouting, then silence. By the time I got downstairs, the place was like this, and Dad was gone." "Gone," I repeated, trying to process the information. "Just like that. Did you see anyone? Hear a car?" Margaret shook her head, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "Nothing. It was like he vanished into thin air. The police think he was taken." The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. Kidnapping. It seemed impossible, yet here we were. "Have there been any demands?" I asked, my mind racing. "Any calls or messages?" "Nothing yet," Richard replied, his voice strained. "The police said that's unusual. They think it might not be about money." I frowned, looking around the room again. Something wasn't adding up. If it wasn't about money, then why ransack the place? And why Charles? He's not exactly a public figure. Neither Richard nor Margaret had an answer for that. As I continued to survey the room, my eyes fell on the dining room doorway. The room where, just last night, we had shared that fateful dinner. A thought struck me. "The dining room," I said suddenly. "Is it like this too?" Richard looked confused. "What?" "No, it's fine. Why would that matter?" Without answering, I walked to the dining room, ignoring Richard's protests. As I pushed open the door, I felt a chill run down my spine. The room was immaculate. The table was still set from last night's dinner, the expensive china and crystal untouched. It was as if this room existed in a different reality from the chaos in the rest of the house. I turned back to Richard and Margaret, who had followed me. Don't you think that's odd? If someone broke in and ransacked the place, why leave this room untouched? They exchanged a glance that I couldn't quite interpret. I don't know, Margaret said, her voice quavering. Maybe they didn't come in here. But I was already moving, examining the room more closely. Something caught my eye on the polished surface of the sideboard. Leaning in, I could just make out a faint smudge, like someone had wiped something away in a hurry. Did the police dust for prints in here? I asked, not taking my eyes off the smudge. No, Richard stammered. They focused on the living room and Dad's study. That's where the disturbance was. I straightened up, my mind whirling with possibilities. I think they need to check in here too. Something's not right. Just then, one of the officers appeared in the doorway. Mr. and Mrs. Hartley, we've finished our preliminary investigation. We'll need you both to come down to the station to make formal statements. Richard nodded, looking relieved to have something concrete to do. As they turned to leave, Margaret caught my arm. Emily, she said, her voice low and urgent. I know we've had our differences. But please, help us find Charles. You've always been clever, more observant than the rest of us. If anyone can figure this out, it's you. I looked into her eyes, searching for any sign of the contempt she had shown me just hours before. All I saw now was desperation and fear. I'll do what I can, I said finally. Not for you, but because it's the right thing to do. As Richard and Margaret left with the police, I found myself alone in the grand house that had once been my home. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hall. I walked slowly through the rooms, trying to see them with fresh eyes. In Charles's study, I paused. The room was a mess, drawers pulled out and papers strewn about. But something seemed off about it. The chaos felt orchestrated somehow. I began to sift through the papers on the desk, not sure what I was looking for but certain that there was more to this story than met the eye. As I worked, my mind kept returning to the events of the past 24 hours. The humiliating dinner, my sudden expulsion from the family, and now Charles's mysterious disappearance. Were they connected somehow? It seemed impossible, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. Hours passed as I combed through the house, looking for any clue that might shed light on what had happened. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, I heard the front door open. Richard's voice called out, sounding exhausted. Emily, are you still here? I emerged from the study, my head spinning with questions and theories. Richard stood in the foyer, looking even more haggard than before. The police are no closer to finding Dad, he said, slumping against the wall. They're talking about organizing a search party, checking hospitals, but they say the first 48 hours are crucial in cases like this. I nodded, my mind still racing. Richard, I said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Is there anything you're not telling the police? Anything at all that might help find Charles? He looked at me sharply, a flicker of something, fear, guilt, crossing his face. What are you implying, Emily? I'm not implying anything, I said, holding his gaze. I'm asking. Because something about this whole situation doesn't add up. The untouched dining room, the staged-looking mess in the study. Richard, if you know something, you need to tell me. For Charles's sake. For a moment, I thought he might confess something. But then his face hardened, the familiar mask of arrogance slipping back into place. You're tired, Emily. You're seeing conspiracies where there are none. Maybe you should go back to your motel. We'll call you if there's any news. I stood my ground. I'm not leaving, Richard. Not until we get to the bottom of this. Whether you like it or not, I'm involved now. And I intend to find out the truth, no matter where it leads. As we stood there in the fading light, facing each other like strangers, I realized that this was just the beginning. Whatever had happened to Charles, whatever secrets this family was hiding, I was determined to uncover them all. Little did I know, the path to the truth would be more twisted and dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews, frantic phone calls, and sleepless nights. I had taken up residence in one of the guest rooms, much to Richard's barely concealed annoyance. But I wasn't about to leave now, not when I was convinced there was more to Charles' disappearance than met the eye. I spent every waking moment combing through the house, searching for clues that the police might have missed. The dining room became my focal point. That untouched space in the midst of chaos nagged at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I found myself returning to it again and again, certain that it held the key to unraveling this mystery. On the third day after Charles' disappearance, I was examining the sideboard for what felt like the 100th time when I noticed something. The smudge I had seen earlier wasn't just a smudge. Under the right light, I could make out the faintest outline of what looked like a partial fingerprint. My heart racing, I called out for Richard. He appeared in the doorway moments later, looking haggard and irritated. "What is it now, Emily? Have you found another clue in the carpet fibers?" I ignored his sarcasm. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the barely visible print. "I think we need to call the police back. They need to dust this entire room for prints." Richard's expression changed from annoyance to something I couldn't quite read. "Was it fear?" "Don't be ridiculous," he said, his voice tight. "The police have already been through the house. They said this room wasn't disturbed." "But that's just it," I insisted. "Why wasn't it disturbed? Everything else was torn apart, but this room was left perfectly intact. Doesn't that strike you as odd?" Before Richard could respond, we heard the front door open and close. Margaret's voice called out, sounding strained. "Richard! Emily! Are you here?" We found her in the living room, clutching a large manila envelope. Her face was pale, her usual composure completely shattered. This was left on the doorstep," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard snatched the envelope from her hands, tearing it open. I watched as the color drained from his face as he read its contents. "What is it?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. "Is it about Charles?" Richard looked up, his eyes wild. It's a ransom note," he said. "They want $5 million by midnight tomorrow, or they'll kill Dad." The room seemed to spin around me. A ransom note? After 3 days of silence? It didn't make sense. Kidnappers usually made contact much sooner. And why leave the note on the doorstep instead of sending it electronically or calling? As Richard and Margaret fell into a frenzied discussion about how to raise the money, I slipped the envelope from Richard's grasp. Something about it felt off. The paper was high quality, the type you might find in an expensive stationery store. Not the kind of thing your average kidnapper would use. I turned the envelope over in my hands, and that's when I saw it. In the upper left corner, barely visible, was a tiny monogram, CHH. Charles Henry Hartley. This envelope had come from Charles's own stationery supply. My mind raced. Could Charles have written the note himself? But why? And if he had, where was he now? I looked up to share my discovery with Richard and Margaret, but the words died in my throat. They were huddled together, whispering furiously, shooting furtive glances in my direction. I cleared my throat, and they jumped apart like guilty teenagers. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I asked, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. Margaret let out a nervous laugh. "Don't be silly, dear. We're all just worried about Charles." But I wasn't buying it anymore. "No," I said firmly. "There's more going on here. This envelope," I held it up, "it's Charles's personal stationery. And the fingerprint in the dining room, the untouched state of that room. None of this adds up to a kidnapping. What's really going on?" Richard's face hardened. "You're imagining things, Emily. The stress is clearly getting to you. Maybe it would be best if you left. We can handle this family matter ourselves." His dismissal only strengthened my resolve. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "Not until I know the truth." "What are you hiding? And what does it have to do with Charles's disappearance?" The tension in the room was palpable. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then, to my surprise, it was Margaret who broke the silence. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she snapped. "This charade has gone on long enough. Richard, tell her the truth. We're going to need her help anyway if we're going to fix this mess." Richard looked at his mother in shock. "Mother, we can't, we can, and we will," Margaret cut him off. She turned to me, her eyes cold. "You want the truth, Emily? Fine. Charles isn't missing. He's hiding." The words hit me like a physical blow. Hiding? From what? Margaret's laugh was bitter. "From the consequences of his own actions, of course. Your dear father-in-law has been embezzling from his own company for years. Millions of dollars, siphoned off into offshore accounts. He was about to be exposed, so he decided to remove himself from the equation." My head spun as I tried to process this information. But the ransacked house, the kidnapping, all staged, Richard said quietly. "We needed a cover story, something to explain his sudden disappearance. We thought if we could buy some time, maybe we could figure out a way to fix this." I stared at them, these people I had once considered family, feeling a mixture of disgust and pity. "So the ransom note. A desperate attempt to explain why we might suddenly need to transfer a large sum of money," Margaret said. "We didn't count on your persistence in investigating." As the full scale of their deception dawned on me, another thought occurred. "The dinner," I said slowly. "The way you treated me, threw me out, was that part of this too? To get me out of the way?" The guilty looks on their faces told me everything I needed to know. I felt sick. "Where is Charles now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard and Margaret exchanged a look. We don't know," Richard admitted. "He was supposed to contact us once he was safely out of the country, but we haven't heard from him. That's why we called you back. We hoped you might be able to help us find him." I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Help you? After everything you've done? Why on earth would I do that?" Margaret stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with a familiar calculation. "Because, my dear, like it or not, you're involved now. If this comes out, you'll be implicated too. After all, you were part of this family. Who's going to believe you knew nothing about it?" The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. They were right. In trying to uncover the truth, I had unwittingly entangled myself in their web of lies. If I walked away now, I'd be leaving myself vulnerable to whatever story they decided to spin. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. "All right," I said finally. "I'll help you find Charles. But not for your sakes. I'll do it because it's the right thing to do, and because I want to hear the truth from him directly." As I looked at the faces of Richard and Margaret, I realized that this was just the beginning of a much larger, more complex story. The truth was finally coming to light, but with it came new dangers and difficult choices. Whatever happened next, I knew my life would never be the same. Little did I know, the revelations of that day were just the tip of the iceberg. The path ahead would lead me into a world of corporate espionage, international finance, and moral dilemmas I never could have imagined. But in that moment, standing in the living room with the weight of these new truths pressing down on me, I made a silent vow. I would see this through to the end, wherever it might lead. For better or worse, I was now a part of this twisted story, and I was determined to write my own ending. The days that followed were a whirlwind of clandestine meetings, hushed phone calls, and sleepless nights. I found myself in the bizarre position of working alongside the very people who had cast me out, now united in our desperate search for Charles. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I pushed my personal feelings aside. There were bigger issues at stake. My first step was to dig deeper into the company's finances. Richard reluctantly granted me access to the records, though I suspected he was still hiding something. I spent hours poring over spreadsheets and financial reports, looking for any clue that might lead us to Charles. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I stumbled upon something odd. A series of transactions to a company I'd never heard of, Blue Haven Enterprises. The amounts were significant, and the timing coincided with the periods when Charles had allegedly been embezzling funds. "Richard," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty study. "What do you know about Blue Haven Enterprises?" He appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of careful neutrality. "Never heard of them." "Why?" I showed him the transactions. "These payments, they're substantial. And they line up with the missing funds. But I can't find any record of what services this company provided. Richard's face paled slightly, but he quickly composed himself. I'm sure it's nothing. Probably just some consulting firm Dad hired. But I wasn't convinced. The next day, while Richard and Margaret were meeting with their lawyers, I made a few discreet phone calls. It took some persuading and a few well-placed fibs, but I finally got through to someone at the bank that had processed the transactions. Blue Haven Enterprises, the clerk said, sounding confused. That account was closed about a week ago. All funds were transferred to a private account in the Cayman Islands. My heart raced. This had to be it, the key to finding Charles. But as I dug deeper, I realized that the rabbit hole went much further than I'd initially thought. Blue Haven wasn't just a shell company for Charles' embezzled funds. It was part of a complex network of offshore accounts and dummy corporations, all designed to hide money. But not just Charles' money. I found traces of transactions linked to some of the biggest names in the business world, politicians, even a few celebrities. This wasn't just embezzlement. This was a full-blown money laundering operation. As the scale of what I'd uncovered began to dawn on me, I felt a chill run down my spine. This was big, too big for me to handle alone. But who could I trust? Certainly not Richard or Margaret. The police. But what if they were somehow involved too? In the end, I made a decision that would change everything. I reached out to an old college friend who now worked as an investigative journalist. I didn't tell her everything, but I gave her enough to start digging. It was a risk, but it paid off. Within days, she had corroborated my findings and uncovered even more. The story was growing, taking on a life of its own. And at the center of it all was Charles, the man who had started this whole operation. But where was he now? The answer came from an unexpected source. One evening, as I was once again working late in the study, I heard a noise from the hallway. Thinking it was Richard or Margaret, I called out, but there was no response. Curious, I went to investigate. There, skulking in the shadows, was a figure I recognized: Johnson, the Hartleys' longtime butler. He looked terrified, his eyes darting around as if expecting to be caught at any moment. "Johnson," I said softly, "what are you doing here?" He jumped, then seemed to make a decision. "Mrs. Emily," he whispered. "There's something you need to know. About Mr. Charles." Over the next hour, Johnson told me everything. How he had overheard Charles planning his escape. How he had helped him pack a bag and slip away in the dead of night. And most importantly, where Charles was hiding. "A small island in the Caribbean," Johnson said. "Mr. Charles has a villa there, off the books. He said it was his insurance policy if things ever went south." Armed with this information, I knew I had to act fast. Richard and Margaret were getting suspicious of my activities, and it was only a matter of time before they tried to stop me. So I made a plan. The next morning, I told Richard and Margaret that I had a lead on Charles' whereabouts. It wasn't entirely a lie, I just didn't tell them that I knew exactly where he was. "I need to follow up on this lead," I said. "I'm going to need some money for travel expenses." They exchanged a look, then nodded. "Whatever it takes to bring Charles home," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false concern. With their money in my pocket and my journalist friend's promise to hold off on publishing the story for 48 hours, I boarded a plane to the Caribbean. As the coastline disappeared behind me, I felt a mix of excitement and fear. I was on my way to confront the man at the center of this whole mess, my father-in-law, the man who had welcomed me into his family only to cast me aside when it suited him. The island was beautiful, a paradise of white sand beaches and crystal clear water. But I had no time to admire the scenery. Following Johnson's directions, I made my way to a secluded villa on the far side of the island. And there he was. Charles Hartley, the man who had upended my life, sitting on a terrace overlooking the ocean, drink in hand, without a care in the world. He looked up as I approached, surprise flickering across his face before settling into a resigned smile. "Emily," he said, as if greeting an expected guest. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. You always were the clever one." "It's over, Charles," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions inside me. "I know everything. About the embezzlement, the money laundering, all of it." He sighed, setting down his drink. I always knew it would catch up with me eventually. I just hoped I'd have a bit more time in paradise before it did. Over the next few hours, Charles told me the whole story. How it had started small, just a bit of creative accounting to help out a friend. But it had grown, spiraling out of control until he was at the center of a vast network of financial crimes. I never meant for it to go this far, he said, his voice tinged with regret. And I certainly never meant to drag you into it. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the ocean, I made my decision. You have two choices, Charles, I said. You can come back with me now, turn yourself in, and help unravel this whole mess. Or I can walk away, and in 24 hours, the whole story will break in the international press. Either way, it's over. Charles was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the horizon. Then he nodded. You're right, he said softly. It's time to face the music. The journey back was surreal. Charles, once so imposing and larger than life, seemed small and defeated. When we landed, the police were waiting. Someone, I suspect Johnson, had tipped them off. The next few weeks were a blur of police interviews, court appearances, and media frenzy. The story had broken wide open, implicating not just Charles but dozens of other high-profile figures. Richard and Margaret were arrested for their role in the cover-up. The Hartley empire crumbled. Through it all, I stood firm. I told the truth, the whole truth, holding nothing back. It wasn't easy, but it was right. In the end, Charles pleaded guilty to all charges. Before he was led away, he turned to me. I'm sorry, Emily, he said, his voice heavy with regret. For everything. You deserved better. As I watched him go, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was over. The truth was out. Justice, in its imperfect way, had been served. In the aftermath, I found myself at a crossroads. The life I had known was gone, but in its place was an opportunity to start anew. My journalist friend offered me a job, impressed by my investigative skills. You have a knack for uncovering the truth, she said. Why not put it to good use? As I packed up my belongings, preparing to leave the Hartley mansion for the last time, I found myself in the dining room where this had all started. The room that had once intimidated me now seemed small and insignificant. I thought about the Emily who had sat at this table just a few short weeks ago, desperately trying to fit into a world that didn't want her. That Emily was gone. In her place stood a stronger, wiser woman, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror. I smiled at the woman looking back at me. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. The truth had come at a high cost, but it had also brought liberation. And that, I realized, was worth everything. Stepping out into the sunlight, I took a deep breath. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to face it. My story wasn't over, in many ways, it was just beginning. And this time, I would be the one writing it.